Good morning, everyone. This is Candice Bergen, and she is the deputy leader of the Conservative Party. And this is her itemizing all of the scandals in Justin Trudeau's tenure since he's been the Prime Minister. And these scandals aren't insignificant. They are all big scandals. At the end, she says this makes the sponsorship scandal that took down a previous Liberal government look like child's play. And she's right? Like, this is a big deal. And it's interesting that it's not sticky. Now, I've played this before, but this plays into the next couple of clips, or the next couple of tabs. So here we go. This is Candice Bergen on all of the scandals under the Trudeau reign. And interestingly enough, it doesn't really get into Morneau and his inappropriate behavior with We, and a lot of the other scandals that have become apparent since this was first played, or since she first did this in the House. Here we go.
Of non-answers. 6 months into this pandemic, 6 years of government, and this Prime Minister will be remembered for a $343 billion deficit and setting the lowest bar ever for a Prime Minister's conduct in the history of this country. This Prime Minister inappropriately groped a woman. He wore blackface. He and his friends and family took a prepaid, lavish vacation to Billionaire Island. He interfered in an SNC criminal trial. He then fired his Attorney General because she wouldn't go along with his cronyism. He has tried to give almost $1 billion to his friends at We, who not only, we now know, have been campaigning for him, meeting with tens of thousands of young people, trying to get them to vote Liberal. But we've also found out We has given the Prime Minister's family and friends, especially, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And now we found out that the husband of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff got a nice $83 million contract from the Prime Minister. It really is, with the Liberals, about who you know, not what you know. This makes the Liberal sponsorship scandal look like child's play, actually. Right. So can the Prime Minister tell us, oh, he's not here, sorry. Can somebody on the side tell us why the Prime Minister thinks the rules do not apply to him?
And unfortunately for Canadians, that's a question that the Liberals don't like. And we all know that the Liberals just don't answer questions they don't like, and will just usually talk about their speaking point in the House, as Catherine McKenna puts it, right? You find your speaking point, you repeat it until it just becomes fact, right? So that's typical of the Liberals. And it's interesting that Miss Bergen, now she's the deputy leader of the Conservatives, she is taken Trudeau to task, right? She's got this big list of things that he's done wrong. And I've been talking about the prospect of a fall election since they prorogued, right? Because the throne speech is a confidence vote, and if the confidence of the House is not gained by the Liberals, then we're going to the polls, right? And well, here's what's happening, so say sources, behind the scenes in the Liberal caucus, okay? Sources say a revolt is imminent in the Liberal Party. Members who are gravely concerned about Justin Trudeau's unstable behavior are quietly banding together to come forward as a whole to express their concern over his instability. His reign is over just in time to save Canada. Now, I don't know if that's true. I would take that with a grain of salt. That's not a blue check mark. This is a Twitter account who's Canadian, who's interested in it, but I don't know how they would know that. So take that with a grain of salt, but it's one more in a large number of tweets that I've seen talking about potentially having an election this fall. So take it with a grain of salt. Here's another one. Here's my theory on what the Liberals are up to. Okay, this is Spin Assassin. So again, and he's got Wexit in his name. So again, with a grain of salt, but I like this. I like this theory, so we're going to read it. Here's my theory on what the Liberals are up to. This Green New Deal shift sounds crazy because it's meant to be. They want an election because they get weaker every day. They can't call one because it would be selfish to ask for more power and send everyone to the polling stations, right? So they don't like the minority government. They can't maneuver the way they could in a majority government, but it would be selfish to ask for an election to get that majority, right? So what are they going to do? They're going to force an election, right? Okay, back to this. During the pandemic, to trigger an election, they need to make sure it's impossible for the opposition to support the throne speech. That way, the election they want is the opposition's fault, right? It's not optimal for them, and they expect to lose, so that lets them promise the moon without realistically having to implement it. Losing the election will also excuse them from raising taxes, and they get to relentlessly attack the government for raising it. If they get lucky and win, they'll have the blank check they campaigned on. Okay, so it kind of solves all their problems, right? If they lose the election, then they don't have to implement all of the stuff, even the recovery, and they have no plan for the recovery. We're going to get to that in just a minute. But fundamentally, I think that either way, the Liberals escape having to deal with this, right? If you get left holding the bag, right? If the Conservatives get left holding the bag of a $300 billion deficit plus and $1 trillion debt plus, then that's going to be hard to get out of without restructuring things in a way that you're going to actually pay off the debt. And running to the left and promising to give free money forever is just not a viable option, right? And we're going to look at that. Like we've got articles to look at for that very shortly. But it solves all their problems. And if they somehow get elected, they say that legitimizes all of this spending. We can spend this because the Canadian public is behind us in spending this. And they want to move to the left this far too. We're all going to march to the left and we're all going to spend the money until it runs out, I guess, until it runs out. And that's in 1 or 2 years, according to the article I'm going to show you in just a minute. So that's an interesting theory. May or may not be true. We may or may not be headed for an election. I don't know. But here's another one. Daniel Boardman, right? I don't know who Daniel Boardman is. I just saw this. He's the host of Uninterrupted, senior contributor to the National Telegraph, an advocate for all people kind. Oh, he's my kind of guy. Okay. He says, hearing that both the Liberals and Conservatives have rented buses and a plane, so expect an election to be called when Parliament resumes. So all of this kind of fits, right? If they lose, well, they win because they'll probably be in opposition. They'll be able to say, we wouldn't have done this. We would have done it better, which is kind of how Scheer was in opposition. Here's another one. Liberal Party want to take part in our first ever grassroots virtual fundraiser with Justin Trudeau on September 10th at 7 p.m. Chip in any amount to RSVP, any amount, and join the conversation about the important work ahead to keep Canada moving forward. Electioneering, right? And especially electioneering when you're pretending there's a big pandemic out there. Sorry, the numbers don't bear that out, right? We really shouldn't be as locked down as we are. It's really incredible. And at the end of the show, I've got a Rocco Gelati interview for you guys to check out. I'd really like the timeline for Mr. Gelati. I don't know when this stuff is going to be going to court, so I don't know when there will be any kind of relief from the from the mandated mask, etc. So we're talking about the Liberals and Conservatives, the election, the electioneering, all this other stuff. Our elections have become a weird popularity contest, right? Like it used to be that there was heir apparents. This is Aaron O'Toole. He says, enjoying a quiet moment lakeside in Val de Mont with Wexford. Wexford is his dog, I would imagine. Happy Labor Day, and he says the same in French. This is not as big a response as usual, or as the other one, right? So he had a 4,000 K tweet whatever on another thing that he was comparing Justin Trudeau and him, and this one's got less than 1,000. So that's interesting, right? There's nothing offensive in this picture, but our politics have become like a weird popularity contest, right? Like, look at my non-offensive picture with my dog in the lake, and it's so Canadian, and I'm reading a newspaper. Most people would be reading their phones, right? Update. Is there anything new, right? So there's nothing. There's purposely nothing offensive in this. Not that it looks staged, but it looks staged, right? And fine. It's fine. It's a fine picture. Happy Labor Day and all that other fun stuff, right? I hope you're out at the lake and enjoying it stuff. And if that's exactly how you live life, then man, great, wonderful. But it just looks staged to me, right? Make sure there's nothing offensive. Take the beer out of the picture. All that stuff. And really, what should be happening is we should be trading ideas. I think that this is where the government needs to go in the next 2 or 3 years. These are the problems Canada's facing. These are the solutions that my policy or my team is proposing, my party is proposing. Instead, we're like, hey, have you seen my dog? This is a very unoffensive photo, right? I hope you like me more than you like Justin Trudeau. And you're not going to win against the cult of personality for Justin Trudeau. You're not going to do it, right? It's just not going to happen. Sorry about that. My computer just glitched. I'm going to keep going because I'm already 10 minutes in and I don't like post-production. So sorry about that. Little glitches happen now and then. Anyway, fundamentally, if you play their game, I said this yesterday, you're going to lose their game, right? So this cult of personality attempt popularity contest thing that Canadian politics has become, you can fight against it if you actually come up with policy and say, this is what we're about, this is what we think, this is the problem that we want to solve, right? And you have to do it in a way that resonates with people. You have to say things that resonate. I think fundamentally you have to tell the truth. Okay, I was teasing about this article a little bit. Here's Global News, and they say Canada's current deficit level will be unsustainable within 1 to 2 years, PBO. The federal government has no more than 1 to 2 years to rein in the hundreds of billions of dollars in deficits it's racking up through coronavirus spending, or risk the debt being unsustainable. That's according to Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux, who spoke with the West Bloc's Mercedes Stephenson about the federal government's spending ahead of the throne speech on September 23rd, which Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said will pitch ambitious new programs. It's without a doubt that we can't afford deficits of over $300 billion for more than just a few years, said Giroux. And when I say just a few years, I really mean a year or two. Beyond that, it would become unsustainable. So if the government has plans for additional spending, it would clearly have to make difficult choices and either raise taxes or reduce other areas of spending, because it's clear that we cannot afford to have deficits of that magnitude for even the medium term. Okay? You heard that? You understood? We cannot run deficits of $300 billion forever. We can't even run it for 1 or 2 years, because that would become unsustainable right away. Because when you run it for 1 or 2 years, now you have to start budgeting for it every year, right? So, and that becomes unsustainable. We can't do that. We can't even afford it for the medium term, says Giroux. Back to this. Trudeau said in an interview with Global News last week that he plans to roll out an ambitious green agenda in the throne speech, which will come after he prorogued Parliament in the midst of the We Charity scandal. He said the country needs to focus on a green economic recovery to climb out from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the worldwide economic shockwaves the virus created. I just want to point out Mr. Poilievre here says, he says, Liberals will claim handouts to green corporations are really investments that will pay off. But if the investment paid for itself, there'd be no need for a handout. Easy rule. If a business venture needs a government handout, it's a money loser. Right. The difference between the oil fields and green economy is the green economy requires the government to be spending money, and the oil fields require access that companies pay for. We will give you X amount of money to be able to access that land, to drill that oil, to then sell it on the open market and give you a piece of that pie too, because there's so much of that pie that we don't mind giving you your piece because we still make enough money. You see how that's different? Instead of, please, sir, we'd really like to make this solar farm and or wind farm and or other subsidy qualifying business, but we need X number of millions of dollars from taxpayers in order to make it viable, which doesn't mean actually make it a winning business bet, right? Like a profitable business. Make it viable just means get it up and running, right? And then maybe we'll see if it's viable. If it was viable, people would be building it. People would be building. They would say, can we build that thing right there? Because then we could serve all these houses and make all this money. They'd be building it. Instead, they're looking for handouts, right? In order to build it. Okay, back to this. However, the throne speech and any new spending promises in it come as the country is bearing a load of $343 billion deficit this fiscal year, with no clear plan presented by the government on how it plans to pay it down, or when it will rein in spending. That number came from a fiscal snapshot presented by former Finance Minister Bill Morneau in July. It contains no clues as to whether Canadians can expect tax increases or service cuts down the road to pay off the cost of the deficit, though Trudeau has said that the government is not currently eyeing tax hikes. No, because why are they thinking about solving the problem? What they're thinking of doing is turning on the taps, because they've got an inexperienced finance minister who's definitely consulted people who would know, but who's got a mandate to spend more than Morneau did. So, and Morneau spent us into $343 billion of deficit, right? And $1 trillion debt, right? Okay? You understand? This is a problem. Very, very big problem. So they're not currently eyeing tax hikes because they have no idea how they're going to solve this problem. Maybe they're just going to hand it over to the Conservatives. Let them hike the taxes. They get to sit back in opposition and say, oh, they're terrible. And as soon as we start getting things right on track again, then they'll come into power and then spend it all to hell again. Heck, again, excuse me. Back to this. Drew said that even if the government maintains the current deficit level but shifts the spending around, that won't solve the problem. The amount, he said, needs to be brought under control. Quote, what's concerning is the absence of a longer-term plan, he said. That is concerning to me and to most people who are concerned about public finances. Yes, or any layman who can see the balance books and say, that's a lot more than any deficit I've ever seen in the history of Canada. Period. Yeah. Okay. Back to this. He said it's one thing to spend to support the country during a crisis, and does not believe anyone would argue that spending was not needed. Quote. But what people and credit rating agencies, financial markets, and Canadians are waiting to see is what the government's plan to get out of that crisis, and what are the public finances likely to look like in the next year and the next couple of years. He said. As the crisis is evolving and we are in months 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the crisis, I think it's reasonable for Canadians to expect more from the government in terms of what's the plan going forward. Yeah, are we just going to keep lumbering around and going, oh, it's a crisis. Don't you know it's a crisis? This is unprecedented. We don't know because it's a crisis. Well, the money's kind of the same, right? The money's kind of the same, and the bad governance is kind of the same, and the cronyism's kind of the same. So I don't think this excuse is good enough anymore. Right? I don't think it's viable. I don't think that it's worthwhile to believe the BS coming out of the government. And maybe that'll lead to an election. Who knows? Can you imagine Trudeau being opposition leader? I think he'd probably step down. Here's some concerning censorship news. Here's Catherine McKenna tweeting about an article in Global News. She says, well, she quotes, quote, we have free speech in our society, but people can't say everything. You can't be verbally abused, or you can't verbally abuse someone. Well, we're doing it in the real world. We can do it in the virtual world as well. Well said, Mr. Gellibo. Right. Sure. Yeah. I don't like this at all. Here's the article. Letting tech giants like Facebook regulate themselves simply not working, says Minister. Canadian Heritage Minister Stephen Gellibo says governments around the world have tried giving big tech firms like Facebook the chance to regulate themselves for things like extremism and hate speech, but the firms have proven they either cannot or will not do so. And he said in an interview with the West Block's Mercedes Stevenson, these platforms can't regulate themselves. We've tried that, and it's simply not working, he said. When asked what the government is doing to try and get social media and technology firms to take responsibility for the content shared and posted on their platforms. He said he and cabinet colleagues are working on a plan that will be putting forward legislation in the very near future. The goal, he suggested, is to find a way to mirror the protections in place in the physical world to those that should be available to people online. In Canada, courts have consistently ruled that while freedom of expression is a constitutional right, reasonable limits can be imposed on that right, prohibiting threats, hate speech, and incitement to violence, for example. Here's the thing about hate speech, though. Here's the hate speech Wikipedia entry, and it says, hate speech laws in Canada include provisions in the Federal Criminal Code and some other federal legislation. There's also statutory provisions relating to hate publications in some, but not all of the provinces and territories. Even though it fails to define what hate speech is, the Criminal Code creates criminal offenses with respect to different aspects of hate propaganda. Those offenses are decided in the criminal courts and carry penal sanctions such as fines, probation orders, and imprisonment. The government also has standards with respect to hate publications and federal laws relating to broadcasting. So hate laws or hate speech isn't clearly defined in the criminal code, and people aren't going around enforcing any kind of standard with regard to how people are addressing each other, right? Like, you've misgendered somebody, get in here, you, right? Like, you hateful person. I'm very concerned about which direction this would go. I've seen articles from the Globe and Mail about decolonize your garden, right? And implying hate speech is the default setting for specific races, right? Like, if you are a white person, you are inherently racist. And so how does that fit into this? How does that work for hate speech? Because apparently that's the law now. Apparently that's something that cannot even be questioned. So with hate speech being poorly defined, I'm very, very uncomfortable with this Mr. Gellibo going in this direction at all. This is a very, very, very poor idea. It's not good, and is concerning. We're sliding further into tyranny daily, and it's wild. Okay, here we go. Back to this. Last week, Facebook Australia threatened to cut off individuals and journalism outlets from sharing news content on the platform in response to a plan by the government there to introduce a bill that would force it and other online giants to share royalties with the media organizations whose content they post. Okay. Facebook was originally designed to have to share links back and forth and to post family pictures and to connect with your family. It's turned into this giant publishing warehouse that is somehow able to shape your speech. So remove things that it decides are against its community terms, but also has protection that they're not publishing or deciding those kind of things. And that's the reason they have protection or something to that effect. There's a whole legal protection in the United States that they're not publishers, there's some other classification, and because of that, they can publish things with impunity, protected from a legal challenge. But because they shape the conversation, because they censor people, and they largely censor right-wing people while leaving some very, very hateful left-wing stuff up, they're being criticized and being threatened by Trump for removal of this protection. And so I think it's weird that the Trudeau government is saying they being Facebook and the other media giants aren't doing enough to censor right-wing people. They aren't doing enough to censor hate speech, despite the fact that hate speech isn't defined. And because of that, we have to take over as the government to make sure that they fall in line with the censorship that we think is applicable and acceptable in our country. And wow, just that's where we're at. No longer is Facebook something for a consumer to use. It is a tool for the government to wield to turn to help further program you, to make sure that you don't see any of those evil ideas that might spark other ideas in your head, and instead only consume exactly what the state wants you to consume. Isn't that concerning to you? Isn't that wrong? Shouldn't you get to decide what's not good? And if you think it's not good, maybe you mute it for yourself and other people can choose to view it or not if they choose, right? Man, it's just really, really concerning. Back to this. At the same time, the threat to cut off real news follows years of big tech firms like Facebook allowing misinformation to circulate and doing little to shut it down, despite repeated urging from policymakers to get control of the situation. Yeah, they're getting to the point where they're saying, if Uncle Chuck shares an InfoWars link, then you should probably unfollow Uncle Chuck because Uncle Chuck is not a very good person, right? And you want to be a good person. You don't want to be associated with people like Uncle Chuck. Right? That's the level we're getting to here, right? Just shut them down. Just shut them down. If they're going to share those links, get them gone. We don't want them on our platform anyway. The links or the people. Back to this. Gallibo said he plans to table a bill once the House of Commons resumes this fall that would force web giants like Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Prime, and others to create Canadian content. Oh, great. That's a requirement already placed on domestic companies like broadcasters. We're going to put some fairness into the Canadian regulatory system because right now there is no fairness, he said. We have Canadian companies that have regulatory obligations and we have internet web giants that have none, and that's unsustainable. Oh yeah? Is that unsustainable, spending $300 billion a year every year on deficit spending? Yeah, just like that. Exactly the same. Okay, here's a, you know what, I'm going to skip this to the end. Hold on, we'll skip this to the end. Yep. Here is Gerald Butts. I was going to go into this, but I've been talking about Gerald Butts as trying to roll out federally what he did to Ontario in 2009. Here's a better article about what Gerald Butts and his green energy plans did to Ontario back in the day when they doubled our electricity costs and we got nothing of real value for it. And it says, Gerald Butts still denies responsibility for a bigger scandal, Ontario's green energy catastrophe. And here's the article, and you can read it. Here is the COVID deaths in June versus the overdose deaths in June in BC. I don't have a source for this, but I don't have any reason to believe the Friends of Science are spreading misinformation, although do take it with a grain of salt. But there's quite a factor, like a factor of 10, right? More overdose deaths than COVID deaths. And because of that, it seems, that's not the right one, hold on. It seems wrong-headed for the government to be focusing only on vaccines and solving the COVID-19 problem and completely ignoring the overdose problem. Focusing on just vaccines and safe supply. Have you heard this safe supply thing? That's code for taxpayer-funded buying drugs for addicts. Safe supply. How about a safe cessation program? That's a stopping program. How about helping them stop the drugs? How about saying, if you want help, wonderful, we'll give you help, but first you have to stop taking all these drugs, and then we'll give you the help. And if you don't stop taking the drugs, then the consequences for your actions will be X, Y, and Z. that it worked in. There are states that it worked in. I don't have the state off the top of my head. Here is a September 4th article. It says Manitoba's education minister under fire for comments on rights to refuse vaccine in midst of pandemic. This is the last story. Well, last made big story for today. Manitoba's education minister is under fire for a Facebook post in which he defended the rights of people to refuse to get a vaccine. For those who refuse to get a vaccine, that is absolutely your right, and it should be protected. Kevin Gordon, who was previously health minister in Premier Brian Pallister's progressive conservative government, said in a post Wednesday. For everyone else, the post continued, sharing a CNN story that reported the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had told states to prepare to distribute COVID-19 vaccines as early as the end of October. Opposition NDP leader Wab Knew, sorry if I got that wrong, said the minister's post on his personal Facebook account is concerning since Gordon is the minister in charge of running flu clinics in schools. It's completely bananas to me, and it's not just... Sorry, before I read this, I want you to notice the language she uses here, okay? It's completely bananas to me. It's crazy. It's not just any cabinet minister. This is a guy who's in charge of all the kids going back to school. He's in charge of their safety and their health. Knuell said outside the Manitoba legislature on Friday. The question remains, how do the members of Mr. Pallister's government feel about vaccines, and are they with the anti-vaxxers, or are they actually with the public health experts? So you're either with us, the public health experts, or you're against us. You're an anti-vaxxer. And there's no gray. There's no, oh, you're right to be concerned about the fast tracking of this virus. You're right to be concerned that it was developed by CanSino, which is a Chinese company essentially, or previously it was being developed by CanSino. You're right to be concerned. I'm going to say about the timeline again, because a vaccine takes 10 to 15 years to be developed, not a year and a half, right? Just because you really want it. And did you see what happened to the SARS vaccines? Have you seen what happened to the MERS vaccines? They failed spectacularly and injured people in the same while they were failing. So no, this is not anti-vaxxers. I don't appreciate this language. It's inflammatory and meant to. You don't want to be in the company of people who are bananas, right? You don't want to be people who are anti-vaxxers, right? So like most reasonable people reading this article, you'd be like, well, I hope they're with the public health experts, but it's a wrong-headed argument. Okay, back to this. Gordon said in a statement Friday he supports the vaccinations and gets a flu shot every year with his family. He said, as the province's former health minister, he also participated in annual vaccination promotional campaigns. Quote, while I personally support vaccination, I also believe that vaccination should be a personal choice. There has never been a mandatory vaccine in Canada, federally or provincially, he said. Federal Health Minister Patty Haydu has previously said the government wouldn't force Canadians to get a COVID-19 shot, as vaccinations are not federally mandated. In some provinces, though, some vaccinations are required before children can enroll in school. And Haydu took pains to talk about how some vaccines were mandated to go back to school, and maybe we'll look at some kind of model like that. I don't know if she said exactly those words, but there was the implication that they could look at that model. Here's a report. I've been reporting that SNC had gotten, or I've been talking about it as if it were true, and this is the Minister of Energy of Alberta, and she says the broadly circulating myth about SNC-Lavalin getting contracts to clean up wells in Alberta is getting a little out of hand. It makes for interesting conversation, but it's just not true. Alberta's site rehabilitation program has approved $198 million in grant funding to 306 Alberta-based companies. SNC-Lavalin is also not a prime contractor under the OWA. The OWA is separate from the billion-dollar SRP. These rumors have been circulating for months about the SRP and the OWA, but they are not true. Okay, so, and I did a bit more reading because I thought, man, I'm sure that I saw SNC got contracts for orphan mines, and I just couldn't find it. What I did find was it was BC. So there were BC orphan mines, or orphan wells, excuse me, not mines, and that's where SNC got the contract. Now I don't know what Ms. Krause is talking about with the 700 French Quebec people working in Lloydminster. I haven't heard anything other than this tweet about that. But I think that it's an interesting thing that even if I couldn't find verification that SNC got the mine cleanups in BC. I couldn't find an article about that. So I don't know if that's true. And I'm not trying to start a rumor. That was speculation over why this rumor got started in the first place. But yeah, I don't know. So SNC did not and is not working in Alberta. The last clip I'll leave you with today, and I'm not going to play any of it. This is Rocco Galati, and he's taking the government to court from Justin Trudeau to the CBC to Doug Ford and John Tory and some municipal public health people for the mask mandates. I would really love to know the timeline. I've watched about 20 minutes of this. It's 50 minutes. I don't know if they talk about the timeline in this, so I don't have any like, oh, this is super good. He does a 2-minute summation of the statement of claim. That's interesting. It's worth watching. It's in the first 15 minutes or so. I don't know, 6 minutes, 7 minutes in maybe. And yeah, worth your watch if you're interested in these rules and laws and all of that other stuff. And I think that's about it for me. It's a half an hour. Oh my goodness, I didn't realize I was going that long. Oh well. Thanks for watching, everybody. Check out CanadaPoly.com. Check out CanadaReport.co. And have a wonderful, wonderful day. Uh-oh, where's my mouse? It's there somewhere.